Some mornings arrive like a sledgehammer to the soul, crushing every last fragment of hope you thought you had left. For Jake Martinez, a single father barely holding his world together in the small town of Millbrook Valley, this Tuesday morning was shaping up to be one of those devastating days. His ancient Honda had finally given up the ghost in the driveway. His ex-wife was threatening to take his son away unless he could prove financial stability, and his bank account showed a soul-crushing $23.47. But what would happen when this struggling single father performed CPR on a mysterious billionaire after a horrific accident, only to have the woman wake up and immediately ask him to marry her? Before we dive into this incredible true story that will restore your faith in unexpected miracles, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story moves you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got another life-changing story that you absolutely won't want to miss. The morning had started like every other morning in the Martinez household, which meant it started with barely controlled chaos. Jake stood in his cramped kitchen, staring at the coffee maker that had decided to join the growing list of broken appliances in his life. The linoleum floor beneath his worn work boots was peeling at the edges, revealing the concrete subfloor underneath, a perfect metaphor for how exposed and vulnerable everything in his life had become. "Dad, the shower's making that weird grinding noise again," called out his son Daniel from upstairs, his voice carrying that particular note of frustration that only 10-year-old boys could master. Even in his annoyance, there was something in his tone that made Jake's chest tighten with a mixture of fierce love and overwhelming worry. "I'll look at it after breakfast, buddy," he called back, though they both knew he'd been saying that for 3 weeks now. The truth was, he couldn't afford to call a plumber, and his own attempts at fixing it had only made the grinding worse. Every time he heard that sound, it reminded him of how many things in their lives were slowly falling apart. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, his dark hair still messy from sleep, wearing the oversized flannel shirt that had belonged to his mother before everything went wrong. At 10 years old, he was already showing signs of the young man he would become. Jake's determined chin, his mother's quick wit, but also a careful watchfulness that no child should have to carry. There was a maturity in his eyes that broke Jake's heart, the kind of awareness that comes from living in a household where every dollar is counted twice. "Dad, the shower's making that weird grinding noise again," he said, settling into his usual chair at the small wooden table. The chair had been his mother's spot once, back when Carmen still lived with them, back when Jake still believed that love and good intentions were enough to hold a family together. "Cold showers build character," Jake said, forcing a grin as he opened the refrigerator. The shelves were embarrassingly sparse, a carton of milk that would expire tomorrow, some leftover pizza from 3 days ago that he couldn't afford to waste, and a package of lunch meat that had definitely seen better days. The sight of it made his stomach clench with familiar shame. "How about some cereal?" he offered, trying to keep his voice light. Daniel wrinkled his nose. "There's only that store-brand stuff left." The store-brand stuff. Even his 10-year-old son had learned to measure their lives in terms of what they could afford and couldn't afford. Jake felt the familiar knot of failure twist in his stomach. 2 years since Carmen had walked out, claiming she couldn't handle the stress of small-town life and family responsibilities, and he still felt like he was drowning in quicksand, fighting for every breath. He poured the last of the milk over Daniel's bowl of generic cornflakes, leaving just enough for his coffee if you could call the instant powder they bought coffee. He watched his son eat, noticing how Daniel pushed the soggy cereal around with his spoon, making it last longer. His brilliant, considerate boy who never complained about their circumstances, even when they both knew he deserved so much better. "Dad, Mrs. Patterson wants to see you after school today," he said carefully, not meeting his eyes. Mrs. Patterson was the guidance counselor at Millbrook Elementary, and in Jake's experience, guidance counselors never wanted to chat about good news. About what, buddy? Daniel's shoulders tensed slightly. The enrichment program thing, the one for advanced students. The enrichment program. Daniel had tested into a special academic track that could set him up for scholarship opportunities, maybe even early admission to prestigious high schools. It was everything he dreamed for his son, a chance to break free from the cycle of struggle that seemed to define life in Millbrook Valley. There was just one crushing problem. The program required a family contribution of $1,200 per semester for materials, field trips, and special resources.
"Your mother was generous with compliments when she wanted to be," Jake replied, ruffling his son's hair. "But the smart part? That's all you, kiddo." They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, Daniel reading a library book about marine engineering while he ate. Watching him, Jake felt the familiar mixture of fierce pride and bone-deep terror that defined his days. Daniel was brilliant, curious about everything, destined for things far beyond the narrow confines of their struggling small town. But brilliance didn't pay for enrichment programs, and destiny didn't put food on the table. After Daniel left for school, backpack stuffed with library books and the kind of resilient optimism that only children could maintain in the face of impossible odds, Jake stood in his empty kitchen and tried to figure out how he was going to make $1,200 appear out of thin air. His phone buzzed with a text message, and for one desperate moment, hope flared in his chest. Maybe a construction job. Maybe someone needed handyman work. Instead, it was Carmen. "Danny's school thing today. Try not to mess it up like everything else. Kids deserve better than what you can give him. Moving back to get custody soon. C." Even 2 years later, she still had the ability to make him feel small and worthless with just a few carefully chosen words. Their marriage had imploded spectacularly 18 months after Daniel was born. 18 months of Carmen's restlessness, her inability to settle into small-town life, her growing resentment toward the responsibilities of motherhood. When she'd finally left for Seattle, claiming she needed to find herself, Jacob felt relief mixed with terror. Relief that the constant tension was over, terror that he was now completely alone with a toddler and no clear path forward. The custody agreement gave Jake primary custody, but Carmen's new life in the city, working as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup, living in a modern apartment with granite countertops, had been making her reconsider. The enrichment program meeting felt like a test, one more chance for Jake to prove his inadequacy as a father. Jake walked outside to where his Honda sat in the driveway. A 2001 model with more rust than paint and an engine that sounded like it was planning its own funeral. He'd bought it used when Daniel was 6, back when he still had steady work with Morrison Construction and could manage the monthly payments. Now it was held together by desperation, duct tape, and whatever mechanical knowledge he'd picked up from YouTube videos. He turned the key. Nothing. Tried again, a grinding sound that made him wince. On the third try, the engine caught, coughed, and promptly died. "Come on," he muttered, trying again. "Not today, please not today." But today was exactly when it would happen, because that's how his life works. When things were already impossible, they found a way to get impossibly worse. His phone rang. Morrison Construction, probably calling about weekend work. Hope surged again, brief and desperate. "Jake, it's Bill Morrison. Listen, I've got some bad news. The Hendricks renovation project got canceled. They decided to go with a bigger firm out of Portland. I'm going to have to cancel your weekend contract." The Hendricks renovation. 3 days of work that would have covered most of Daniel's program fee. Gone. Just like that. "I understand, Bill. Thanks for letting me know." He hung up and sat on his front porch steps, looking out at the quiet street where he'd lived for most of Daniel's life. Millbrook Valley was the kind of place where neighbors still waved to each other, where the biggest excitement was usually the high school football team making it to regional playoffs. It was also the kind of place that people left. The smart ones, the ambitious ones, the ones with dreams bigger than small-town limitations. Daniel was one of those. He deserved every opportunity to spread his wings and soar. And Jake was the anchor dragging him down to the bottom of the ocean. By noon, Jake had called every construction company, restaurant, and handyman service within 50 miles looking for work. Nothing. The economy in Millbrook Valley had been struggling for years, ever since the textile mill closed and took half the town's jobs with it. Young families moved away looking for opportunities. Older families held on, watching their dreams get smaller every year. The afternoon stretched ahead of him like an empty highway. He had to meet with Mrs. Patterson at 3 p.m. to sit across from her desk and explain why he couldn't afford to give his brilliant son the opportunities he deserved. Had to look the woman in the eye and admit that he was failing as a father. The thought made his chest tight, made it difficult to breathe. He needed to get out, needed to move, needed to do something other than sit in his broken-down house thinking about all the ways he was letting Daniel down. The lake at the edge of town had always been his refuge. As a teenager, he'd spent countless hours walking the trails that wound around the shoreline, skipping stones and dreaming about the future he was going to build. Later, when he was married to Carmen and still believed they could make it work, they'd brought baby Daniel there for picnics, watching him toddle around the sandy beach while they made plans for the family they were going to become. Now, at 32 years old, with everything falling apart around him, Jake found himself walking toward the water again. Maybe the quiet would help him think. Maybe the familiar peace of the place would give him some kind of clarity about what to do next.
He locked the house and started walking, his work boots crunching on the gravel path that led down to the lake. October in Oregon meant the trees were dressed in their finest colors, gold and red and orange that took your breath away if you remembered to look up from your troubles long enough to notice. The familiar trail wound through a small wooded area before opening up to reveal the lake, its surface like glass reflecting the autumn sky. Jake had been walking for about 15 minutes, lost in his thoughts about impossible school fees and broken cars and his son's disappointed face, when he heard something that definitely didn't belong. The screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal against metal, and then an eerie silence that made his blood run cold. He ran toward the sound, his heart pounding, following the trail as it curved around toward the main road that skirted the lake. What he found when he rounded the bend would change not just his day, but the entire trajectory of his life. There, wrapped around an ancient oak tree like some kind of expensive Christmas ornament, was a silver sports car that probably cost more than Jake's house. Steam was rising from the crumpled hood, and through the spider-webbed windshield, he could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. A woman with long, dark hair, wearing what looked like an expensive business suit, completely unconscious and possibly dying. And Jake Martinez, single father, failed provider, man whose own life was falling apart, was the only person around to save her. Jake didn't think, he just moved. Years of construction work had trained his body to react first and process later when someone was in danger. He sprinted toward the mangled sports car, his work boots slipping slightly on the damp leaves scattered across the asphalt. The acrid smell of burning oil and hot metal filled his nostrils as he approached the wreckage. The silver Porsche, because of course it was a Porsche, had hit the massive oak tree with enough force to accordion the entire front end. The driver's side door was crumpled inward, but the passenger side looked like it might still open. Jake circled around, his heart hammering against his ribs as he peered through the shattered window. The woman inside was unconscious, her head tilted at an unnatural angle against the deployed airbag. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, staining her pristine white business suit. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath a small, desperate whisper. Jake had seen enough construction accidents to know that she was in serious trouble. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he called out, trying the passenger door handle. It was jammed tight, the frame bent from the impact. He moved back to the driver's side where the door had been pushed inward but might still be workable. Jake braced his feet against the ground and pulled with every ounce of strength he had. The metal groaned in protest, but slowly, agonizingly, the door began to give way. Construction work had given him the kind of functional strength that came from lifting, pulling, and forcing stubborn materials into submission day after day. With a screech of twisted metal, the door finally opened far enough for him to reach the woman inside. She was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe early 30s, with the kind of polished, expensive appearance that screamed money. Her dark hair was pulled back in what had probably been a perfect chignon before the accident, though now it was disheveled and dotted with small pieces of safety glass. Her skin had a grayish pallor that made Jake's stomach clench with worry. "Ma'am, I'm going to help you," he said, even though she couldn't hear him. He'd learned from construction site first aid training that talking to unconscious victims sometimes helped, even if they couldn't respond. Jake carefully felt for a pulse at her neck. It was there, but weak and irregular. Her breathing was becoming more labored, and as he watched, it seemed to slow down even further. Whatever internal injuries she had sustained, they were getting worse by the minute. He pulled out his basic cell phone and dialed 911, praying he could get a signal this far from town. 911? What's your emergency? This is Jake Martinez. I'm on Lakeshore Road, about 2 miles east of Millbrook Valley. There's been a serious car accident. Single vehicle wrapped around a tree. The driver is unconscious and in critical condition. Sir, are you trained in first aid? Basic construction site training, Jake said, never taking his eyes off the woman's face. As he watched, her breathing became even more shallow. Emergency crews are dispatched and should be there in approximately 15 minutes. Do not attempt to move the victim unless there's immediate danger of fire or... The phone crackled and went dead. No signal. Jake stared at the device in frustration, then looked back at the woman. 15 minutes. She didn't have 15 minutes. Her breathing was becoming more and more labored, and as he watched, it seemed to stop altogether. No, Jake muttered, leaning closer. He couldn't detect any breath movement at all. Years of mandatory CPR training on construction sites kicked in. Jake had always hoped he'd never have to use it, but now muscle memory took over. He carefully assessed her position. The car seat was reclined enough that he could work, and her airway seemed clear. He tilted her head back slightly, pinched her nose, and placed his mouth over hers, giving 2 rescue breaths. Her chest rose and fell with each breath he gave her, which was a good sign. Then he placed the heel of his hand on her breastbone and began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, Jake counted under his breath, pushing hard and fast, just like he'd been taught. The training had always seemed abstract before, practiced on plastic dummies in sterile classrooms. This was terrifyingly real, the weight of another person's life literally under his hands. After 30 compressions, he gave her 2 more rescue breaths, then resumed the chest compressions. His shoulders began to ache from the angle and the repetitive motion, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. "Come on," he whispered between compressions. "Come back. Don't you dare give up on me." Jake had no idea who this woman was, but something about her struck him as important. Not just because of the expensive car or the clearly costly clothes, but because of her face. Even unconscious and injured, there was something determined about her features, something that suggested she was a fighter. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes, Jake felt her chest suddenly rise on its own. He stopped the compressions and watched as her breathing resumed, still shallow but definitely there. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment Jake thought she might wake up. Instead, she slipped back into unconsciousness, but her breathing continued. Jake kept his hand on her wrist, monitoring her pulse, which was still weak but seemed more stable than before. The sound of sirens in the distance made Jake's knees go weak with relief. He'd done it. Whatever happened next, he'd kept her alive long enough for the professionals to take over. The ambulance arrived first, followed closely by a fire truck and 2 police cars. Jake moved back as the paramedics took over, watching them work with practiced efficiency. They had her on a backboard and into the ambulance within minutes. "Are you the one who performed CPR?" asked one of the paramedics, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair. "Yeah," Jake said, suddenly feeling shaky now that the adrenaline was wearing off. "You saved her life," the paramedic said simply. "She'd stopped breathing entirely when we got here. If you hadn't started CPR when you did, we would have been too late." Jake watched the ambulance pull away, its sirens wailing as it headed toward the regional hospital 30 minutes away. He gave his statement to the police, explaining how he'd found the accident and what he'd done until help arrived. "Do you know who she is?" asked Officer Bryant, a man Jake recognized from around town. "Never seen her in my life. The car has out-of-state plates. California, I think." "We'll run the plates and contact her family," Officer Bryant said, making notes on his report. "You did good here, Jake. Real good." As the emergency crews finished their work and began to clear the scene, Jake found himself strangely reluctant to leave. He kept thinking about the woman in the expensive car, about the moment when her breathing had stopped and started again under his hands. There had been something almost intimate about it, the kind of connection that comes from literally holding someone's life in your hands. But there was nothing more he could do here. The woman was in professional hands now, and Jake had his own life to get back to. He still had to face Mrs. Patterson about Daniel's enrichment program, still had to figure out how to make $1,200 appear out of nowhere. Jake walked back toward town, his mind churning over the events of the afternoon. He'd saved someone's life today. That had to count for something, didn't it? Maybe it was a sign that things were about to change for the better. His phone buzzed with a text message. Daniel checking in from school. "Dad, everything okay? Mrs. Patterson said you missed the meeting. She rescheduled for tomorrow at 3. Jake had completely forgotten about the guidance counselor meeting and the chaos of the accident. Tomorrow. He'd have to face that disappointed conversation tomorrow, when he'd have to admit that he couldn't afford to give his brilliant son the opportunities he deserved. But tonight, at least, he could tell Daniel that his father had saved someone's life. Maybe that would be enough to make his son proud of him, even if it was just for one day. Jake didn't know that 20 miles away, in the intensive care unit of Millbrook Regional Hospital, the woman whose life he had saved was slowly waking up. He didn't know that her name was Alexis Wismore, and that she was worth approximately $2.8 billion. He didn't know that she owned a tech empire that spanned 3 continents, or that she'd been driving to a board meeting that would have determined the fate of thousands of jobs. Most importantly, Jake didn't know that when Alexis Whitmore's eyes opened and she remembered the face of the man who had breathed life back into her lungs, she was going to make a decision that would change both of their lives forever. All Jake knew was that he'd done the right thing when it mattered most, and for a man who'd been feeling like a failure for months, that was enough to carry him through another day. As he walked home through the gathering dusk, he found himself wondering about the woman in the expensive car. Was she okay? Did she have family who were worried about her? Would she remember anything about the accident or about the stranger who had pulled her back from the edge?
He supposed he'd never know. People like her, wealthy, sophisticated, living in a world of private jets and board meetings, didn't exactly move in the same circles as struggling single fathers from small Oregon towns. But Jake was wrong about that. Very, very wrong. Because at that very moment, as he walked home to his son and his broken-down life, Alexis Whitmore was waking up in a hospital bed with one crystal-clear memory, the face of the man who had saved her life, and she was already making plans to find him. Jake made it home just as Daniel was getting off the school bus, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a concerned expression on his 10-year-old face. The afternoon sunlight caught the worry lines around his son's eyes, lines that no child should have to carry, but that seemed permanently etched there these days. "Dad, you look weird," Daniel said without preamble, the way only children could cut straight to the heart of things. "Your clothes are all dirty, and you have that look." "What look?" Jake asked, though he suspected he knew exactly what his son meant. "The look you get when something big happened, but you're trying to pretend it didn't." Daniel had always been perceptive, but lately his ability to read Jake's moods had become almost supernatural. "Did something happen with the truck? Did it finally die completely?" Jake looked down at himself and realized Daniel was right. His word shirt was streaked with oil and dirt from the accident scene, his jeans had grass stands on the knees from kneeling beside the car, and there were small cuts on his hands from dealing with the broken glass and twisted metal. He probably looked like he'd been in a fight. "The truck's fine, buddy." "Well, as fine as it ever is. But something did happen today. I helped someone who was in a car accident." "A real car accident? Was anyone hurt? Did you call 911? Was there blood?" "Easy there, detective," Jake said with a small smile. "Yes, it was a real accident. Yes, someone was hurt pretty badly. Yes, I called 911, and yes, there was some blood, but not too much." They settled on the front porch steps, the same steps where Jake had sat that morning contemplating his failures as a father. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than 6 hours. "Tell me everything," Daniel demanded, settling into what Jake recognized as his serious listening position, crossed legs, hands folded, complete attention focused on the story he was about to hear. Jake found himself editing the details as he spoke, emphasizing the heroic parts and downplaying the moments when he genuinely feared the woman might die in his hands. He told Daniel about finding the car, about pulling open the door, and the ambulance ride to the hospital. He didn't mention the CPR, didn't want to worry his son with the reality of how close the situation had been to tragedy. "So, she's okay?" Daniel asked when Jake finished. "I think so. The paramedics said she'd be fine, and they got her to the hospital quickly." I hope that was true. He'd been thinking about Alexis Whitmore all afternoon, wondering if she'd woken up, if she was going to recover fully from whatever injuries she had sustained. "That's good," Daniel said, with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children brought to extraordinary situations. "It was nice of you to help her. Mom always said you were the kind of person who couldn't walk past someone who needed help." The mention of Carmen made Jake's chest tighten slightly. It's true, she had said that about him, back when she'd meant it as a compliment rather than a criticism, before she'd started seeing his willingness to help others as evidence that he lacked focus on his own family's needs. Speaking of help, Jake steered the conversation toward a safer ground. "How was school today? Any homework I need to help you with?" "Math worksheet and a book report." But his tone suggested those weren't the most important things on his mind. "Dad, did you reschedule the meeting with Mrs. Patterson?" Jake's stomach dropped. In all the chaos of the afternoon, he'd completely forgotten about the guidance counselor meeting that was supposed to determine Daniel's future in the enrichment program. "She moved it to tomorrow at 3. He hoped his voice sounded more confident than he felt. "Good," Daniel said, though there was something careful in his voice. "Because I've been thinking about the money thing." "Daniel..." "No, listen to me. I know the program costs a lot of money that we don't have. I know you've been trying to figure out how to make it work, but maybe I don't need to be in the advanced program. Maybe regular classes are fine." Jake stared at his son, feeling his heart break a little more. Daniel was trying to make his father feel better by giving up on his own dreams. At 10 years old, he was already learning to make his ambitions smaller to fit their circumstances. "Daniel Martinez, you are not giving up on that program. You're the smartest kid I know, and you deserve every opportunity to show the world what you can do. We'll figure out the money somehow." "How?" Daniel asked with devastating directness. "The truck's not working, you can't find steady construction jobs, and Mom keeps texting about how we can't afford things. How are we going to find $1,200?
It was a fair question, and Jake didn't have a good answer. But looking at his son's face, so serious, so accepting of limitations that no child should have to accept, Jake felt something crystallize inside him. He'd figure it out somehow. He had to. "We just will," Jake said. "Sometimes life has a way of providing what you need when you need it most." Daniel looked skeptical, but he nodded. "Okay, Dad, if you say so." They went inside, and Jake helped Daniel with his homework while trying to keep his mind from wandering back to the accident scene. But every few minutes, he found himself thinking about Alexis Whitmore, wondering how she was doing, whether she'd regained consciousness, whether she'd remember anything about what had happened. Jake was stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce for dinner when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Millbrook Regional Hospital, and Jake's heart immediately jumped into his throat. Had something gone wrong? Was the woman worse than the paramedics had thought? "Hello?" "Is this Jake Martinez?" The voice was professional, crisp, definitely a hospital administrator rather than a medical professional. "Yes, this is Jake." "Mr. Martinez, this is Patricia Williams from Patient Services at Millbrook Regional. I'm calling regarding the car accident victim you assisted this afternoon. Miss Whitmore has been asking to speak with you." Jake nearly dropped the phone. "She's awake? She's okay?" "She's stable and conscious, yes. She's quite insistent about speaking with you as soon as possible. Would you be available to visit this evening?" Jake looked around his small kitchen, the spaghetti sauce bubbling on the stove, Daniel bent over his math homework at the kitchen table, the comfortable routine of their evening together. The hospital was 30 minutes away, and visiting hours would end soon. "I don't know if I can make it tonight. I have my son here and—" "Mr. Martinez," the voice interrupted gently, "Miss Whitmore has been quite persistent about this request. She's made it clear that speaking with you is her top priority. Would it be possible for you to come by tomorrow morning, perhaps?" There was something in the woman's tone that suggested this wasn't just a routine thank you visit. Jake felt a strange mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What could this Alexis Whitmore possibly want to talk to him about? "I could probably come by tomorrow morning, around 10, maybe?" "Perfect. I'll let Miss Whitmore know. She'll be in room 314 in the ICU. Just check in at the nurse's station when you arrive." After Jake hung up, Daniel looked up from his homework with obvious curiosity. "Who was that?" "The hospital. The woman from the accident wants to thank me in person." "That's nice of her." But his expression suggested he was thinking about something else. "Dad, do you think she's rich?" "What makes you ask that?" "Well, you said she was driving an expensive car and wearing fancy clothes, and rich people usually want to reward people who help them, right? Like in movies?" Jake felt a warning bell go off in his head. The last thing he wanted was for Daniel to start building unrealistic expectations about some kind of reward from a grateful stranger. Life didn't work that way, especially not for people like them. "Daniel, I want you to listen to me carefully." Jake sat down across from his son at the kitchen table. "I helped that woman because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return. She probably just wants to say thank you, and that's enough. Don't start thinking there's going to be some kind of reward or anything like that." "I know," Daniel said, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of hope that he was trying to hide. "I just thought maybe—" "Maybe what?" "Maybe sometimes good things happen to good people." Jake reached across the table and squeezed his son's hand. "Sometimes they do, buddy, but we can't count on it. We have to keep working to solve our own problems." "I know," Daniel said again, "but it would be nice, wouldn't it, if something good happened for once?" That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Jake sat on his front porch and thought about the phone call from the hospital. There had been something in the administrator's voice, some suggestion that this was more than just a routine thank you visit. The woman had been persistent about seeing him. What could that mean? Jake tried to push down the tiny spark of hope that Daniel's words had ignited. His son was right. It would be nice if something good happened for once. But Jake had learned not to count on nice things. He'd learned to expect disappointment, to plan for the worst, to protect himself and Daniel from the kind of hope that could be crushed. Still, as he sat in the quiet darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of their small town settling in for the night, Jake couldn't quite shake the feeling that tomorrow was going to be different somehow. Maybe it was just the adrenaline from the day's events, or maybe it was the simple satisfaction of knowing he'd saved someone's life. Or maybe, just maybe, Daniel was right about good things happening to good people. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message. He expected it to be Carmen with another cutting comment about his inadequacies as a father. Instead, the message was from an unknown number.
"Mr. Martinez, this is Alexis Whitmore. I hope you don't mind that I got your number from the hospital.
I know it's late, but I couldn't wait until tomorrow to reach out. What you did for me today, there are no words. I need to see you as soon as possible. There's something important I need to discuss with you. Something that could change everything for both of us. Please come to the hospital tomorrow. Room 314. A.W. Jake stared at the message, reading it 3 times before it sank in. Something that could change everything? What could a complete stranger possibly have to discuss with him that was that important? Despite his better judgment, despite all his experience with disappointment and dashed hopes, Jake felt that tiny spark of possibility grow a little brighter. Tomorrow, he would find out what Alexis Whitmore wanted to tell him. And somehow, deep in his gut, Jake had the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Jake arrived at Millbrook Regional Hospital the next morning with 15 minutes to spare, having dropped Daniel off at school with promises to tell him everything about the meeting when he got home. The hospital lobby was busier than he'd expected, filled with the quiet urgency that seemed to permeate all medical facilities. Families clutching coffee cups, doctors walking briskly between elevator banks, and the constant hum of overhead pages calling various personnel to different wings. Room 314 was in the ICU, which required Jake to check in at a security desk and receive a visitor's badge. The nurse who directed him down the hallway was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes who seemed to recognize his name. "You're the one who saved Miss Whitmore's life. She's been talking about you nonstop since she woke up yesterday evening, very determined to see you." "How is she doing?" "Remarkably well, considering. 3 broken ribs, a mild concussion, and some internal bruising, but nothing that won't heal. The doctors said if you hadn't performed CPR when you did, well, let's just say you're a hero around here." Jake felt uncomfortable with the word hero. He'd just done what anyone would have done in the same situation. At least, he hoped anyone would have done the same thing. The nurse stopped outside room 314. "She's been awake most of the night, actually. Very anxious to speak with you. I'll leave you two alone, but if she gets too excited or starts showing signs of fatigue, please call for me immediately." Jake knocked softly on the doorframe and heard a clear, strong voice call out, "Come in." The woman sitting propped up in the hospital bed looked nothing like the unconscious, injured figure he'd pulled from the wrecked Porsche yesterday afternoon. Alexis Whitmore was strikingly beautiful, even with a bandage across her forehead and her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her eyes were a remarkable shade of green, sharp and intelligent, and they fixed on Jake's face with an intensity that made him suddenly self-conscious. "Jake Martinez," she said, and there was something in her voice, relief, gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "Please sit down. I've been waiting to meet you properly." Jake took the chair beside her bed, noting that even in a hospital gown, Alexis Whitmore had an air of authority about her. This was clearly someone accustomed to being in charge, to having her wishes accommodated immediately. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked, because that seemed like the polite place to start. "Alive," she said simply. "Thanks to you. The doctors told me what you did, that I'd stopped breathing, that you performed CPR for several minutes before the paramedics arrived. They said I would have died if you hadn't been there." Jake shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I just did what anyone would have done." "No," Alexis said firmly. "Most people would have called 911 and waited. Most people don't know CPR, and even fewer would have had the courage to use it on a stranger. You saved my life, Jake Martinez, and I don't take that lightly." There was a moment of silence as they looked at each other. Jake found himself studying her face, trying to reconcile this composed, articulate woman with the unconscious, injured figure he'd worked so desperately to revive yesterday afternoon. "Can I ask you something?" Alexis said. "What were you doing out there, on that road at that exact moment? It wasn't exactly a busy area." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. How could he explain that he'd been walking aimlessly because his life was falling apart? That he'd been trying to clear his head before having to admit to a school counselor that he couldn't afford to give his son basic educational opportunities?
I was just taking a walk, he said. Needed some air, some time to think. About what? The question was direct, but not intrusive. There was genuine curiosity in her voice, as if she really wanted to understand. Jake hesitated. Something about Alexis Whitmore made him want to be honest, even though honesty meant admitting things he'd barely acknowledged to himself. My son, Daniel. He's 10 years old, incredibly smart, and he got accepted into this advanced academic program at his school. It's exactly the kind of opportunity I've always dreamed for him. But Jake trailed off, unsure how much to reveal to the stranger. But, Alexis prompted gently, but it costs $1,200 per semester, and I don't have $1,200. I don't have $12 most days. The words came out in a rush, and Jake immediately regretted them. This woman was clearly wealthy. The car alone probably cost more than Jake made in 2 years. She didn't need to hear about his financial problems.
But instead of the awkward silence or polite dismissal he expected, Alexis leaned forward with obvious interest. Tell me about Daniel. For the next 20 minutes, Jake found himself talking about his son in a way he rarely did with anyone. He told Alexis about Daniel's curiosity, his intelligence, his mature understanding of their financial limitations. He talked about how Daniel had offered to give up the enrichment program to spare Jake the stress of finding the money. He even mentioned Carmen's threats about custody, though he tried to keep the bitterness out of his voice when he spoke about his ex-wife. Alexis listened without interrupting, asking occasional questions that showed she was paying careful attention. When Jake finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "What do you do for work?" she asked. "Construction, mostly. Handyman jobs when I can find them. The economy in Millbrook Valley isn't exactly booming." Jake paused. "What about you? What kind of work takes you through small Oregon towns in a Porsche?" For the first time since he'd arrived, Alexis seemed hesitant. "I run a company, technology sector. I was driving to a board meeting in Portland when the accident happened." "Must be a successful company," Jake said, gesturing vaguely at what he assumed were expensive pajamas under her hospital gown. Alexis smiled, but there was something sad about it. "Success is a complicated word, Jake. Yes, my company is financially successful, very successful, but until yesterday, I couldn't tell you the last time I had a real conversation with another human being. The kind of conversation where someone asks about my thoughts instead of my quarterly projections." There was something vulnerable in her admission that caught Jake off guard. Here was a woman who clearly had everything money could buy, and she was talking about loneliness in a way that sounded painfully familiar. "What's your company called?" Jake asked. "Whitmore Technologies. We develop software applications, mostly for business and productivity." She paused. "You probably haven't heard of us." Jake hadn't, but he nodded politely. "That sounds important." "I used to think it was the most important thing in the world. Building the company, growing the revenue, beating the competition. I haven't taken a real vacation in 4 years. I work 16-hour days as a matter of routine. I have an assistant who manages my personal life because I don't have time to manage it myself." That sounds exhausting. It is, but it's also addictive. The constant motion, the feeling that you're always accomplishing something significant. Alexis looked directly at Jake. "Until yesterday, when I was unconscious in that car, and I had this, I guess you'd call it, near-death experience. I don't know if it was real or just my brain processing trauma, but I had this incredibly vivid experience of watching my life from the outside." Jake waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say was the real reason she'd asked him to come here. "I saw everything I had built, everything I had accomplished, and I realized that none of it mattered. Not in any meaningful way.
And then I saw you, this stranger who risked his own safety to save my life, who gave me CPR and brought me back, who stayed with me until help arrived. And I realized that you, in those few minutes, showed me more genuine human caring than I had experienced in years. I don't understand what you're getting at, Jake said, though something in his stomach was beginning to flutter with nervous anticipation.
Alexis took a deep breath. Jake Martinez, I know this is going to sound completely insane, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear me out before you say no. Jake nodded, though he had no idea what was coming. Will you marry me? Jake stared at Alexis for a full 10 seconds, certain he'd misheard her. The steady beep of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder in the silence, and he could hear voices in the hallway outside, the normal sounds of a hospital going about its business, while his world tilted completely off its axis. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "Did you just ask me to marry you?" "I did," Alexis said, and there wasn't a trace of uncertainty in her voice. "I know how it sounds. I know we just met, but please let me explain before you have me committed to the psychiatric ward." Jake leaned back in his chair, feeling like he needed something solid to anchor himself to reality. "Okay," he said slowly. "I'm listening." Alexis shifted in her hospital bed, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at her injured ribs. "When I was unconscious yesterday, during those minutes when I wasn't breathing, I had the most vivid experience of my entire life. I was outside my body, watching everything happen. I could see you working to save me, and I could feel your determination, your refusal to give up, even though you didn't know anything about me." Jake opened his mouth to speak, but she held up a hand. "But more than that, I could somehow sense who you are as a person. Your love for Daniel, your integrity, your strength in the face of impossible circumstances. And I had this overwhelming realization that I'd spent 31 years building a life that meant absolutely nothing, while you've spent the last decade building something real and meaningful with your son." "Alexis," Jake said gently, "you went through a traumatic experience. Sometimes when people nearly die, You think I'm having some kind of psychological breakdown. I understand why you'd think that. But Jake, I've never been more clear-headed in my life. What I'm proposing isn't romance, it's partnership." "Partnership? Think about it logically," Alexis said, and suddenly her voice took on the crisp, authoritative tone that Jake imagined she used in boardrooms. "You need financial stability to provide for Daniel. I need someone genuine in my life, someone who can help me remember what it means to be human instead of just a profit-generating machine." Jake felt his head spinning. "You want to marry me for money? Or you want to pay me to marry you? I don't understand." "Neither," Alexis said firmly. "I want us to help each other. You saved my life yesterday, Jake. Literally brought me back from the edge of death. That creates a bond between us, whether we want it or not. But more than that, in the hour I've spent talking to you this morning, I've felt more like myself than I have in years." "You don't know me," Jake protested. "We've had one conversation." "Sometimes one conversation is enough to recognize something real. Do you know what my last 5 relationships were like? 3 were with men who wanted my money, 1 was with a man who wanted my business connections, and 1 was with a man who was genuinely nice but couldn't handle dating someone more successful than he was." Jake could hear the pain underneath her matter-of-fact delivery. "That sounds lonely." It was. But talking to you today, hearing about your love for Daniel, seeing the way you think about what matters in life, it's like talking to someone from a different planet, a better planet. "Alexis, I appreciate what you're saying, but marriage isn't something you do as a business arrangement, at least not in my world. Isn't it, though? Alexis leaned forward, her green eyes intense. Think about all the successful marriages you know. Most of them work because the partners complement each other, because they bring different strengths to the relationship. I'm not talking about a marriage of convenience. I'm talking about a marriage of purpose. Jake ran his hands through his hair, trying to process what she was suggesting. What exactly would this marriage of purpose look like? We'd be partners in the truest sense. I'd provide financial stability for you and Daniel. You'd help me learn how to live a life that has meaning beyond profit margins. We'd support each other's goals, raise Daniel together, and maybe figure out how to build something neither of us could build alone. And the romantic part? Alexis was quiet for a moment. I won't lie to you. Jake, I find you attractive. Not just physically, though you are handsome in a way that's completely different from the men I usually meet. But I'm attracted to your character, your values, the way you talk about your son. As for whether that could develop into love, I shrugged. I think the potential is there, but I'm not asking you to fall in love with me. I'm asking you to give us a chance to see what we could build together. Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where his own beat-up Honda sat next to a collection of newer, more reliable vehicles. Everything Alexis was saying sounded insane, but there was also a strange logic to it that he couldn't dismiss. What about Daniel? He asked without turning around. How would you explain this to a 10-year-old boy? We'd tell him the truth, that sometimes adults make unconventional decisions for good reasons, that I care about both of you and want to be part of your family. Kids are more adoptable than we give them credit for, especially smart kids like Daniel.
You're talking about completely changing our lives based on one conversation and a near-death experience. I'm talking about taking a chance on something that could be extraordinary, Alexis corrected. Jake, I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Money that's just sitting in accounts, earning more money that I don't need. Meanwhile, you're struggling to afford a $1,200 program that could change your son's entire future. Doesn't that seem backward to you? Jake turned back to face her. So this is about charity after all. No, Alexis said firmly. Charity is one-sided. This would be mutual. I need what you have just as much as you need what I have. Maybe more. What do I have that you could possibly need? You know how to love someone unconditionally. You know how to put another person's needs ahead of your own. You know how to find joy in simple things. You know how to be a good man even when life is kicking you in the teeth. Alexis's voice softened. Jake, I have built a company worth billions of dollars, but I don't know how to build a life worth living. You do. Jake sat back down, his mind racing. Everything about this conversation was surreal, but he couldn't deny that there was something compelling about Alexis Whitmore. Not just her obvious intelligence and success, but something deeper. A loneliness that resonated with his own, a desire for connection that felt genuine despite the bizarre circumstances. Let me ask you something. If I said yes to this insane proposal, what would happen to your company, your board of directors, your business relationships? She smiled for the first time since he had arrived. That's the beauty of it. Marriage to you would actually solve several problems for me professionally. The board has been pressuring me to settle down, to show more stability in my personal life. They think it would be good for the company's image if I weren't seen as a workaholic robot with no life outside the office. So I'd be a convenient PR move. You'd be the best thing that ever happened to me, Alexis said simply, in every possible way. Jake was quiet for a long moment, trying to imagine explaining this conversation to Daniel, to Mrs. Patterson, to anyone in his normal life. This is completely crazy, he said finally. The best things in life usually are, Alexis replied. Jake, I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to think about it. Spend some time with me. Let me spend some time with Daniel. See if what I'm proposing could actually work for all of us.
And if it doesn't work, then we end the marriage and remain friends. I'd still want to help with Daniel's education, but as a friend rather than a stepmother. Jake looked at her carefully. You'd really do that? Help with Daniel's schooling, even if this marriage thing doesn't work out? Jake, that boy is your entire world. Anyone who becomes part of your life becomes part of his life by extension. Of course I'd help with his education. He deserves every opportunity to reach his potential. For the first time since she'd made her shocking proposal, Jake felt something other than disbelief. There was genuine caring in her voice when she talked about Daniel, and that mattered more to him than any amount of money. Let me ask you something. If I said yes to this insane proposal, what would happen to your company, your board of directors, your business relationships? She smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. That's the beauty of it. Marriage to you would actually solve several problems for me professionally. The board has been pressuring me to settle down, to show more stability in my personal life. They think it would be good for the company's image if I weren't seen as a workaholic robot with no life outside the office. So I'd be a convenient PR move. You'd be the best thing that ever happened to me, Alexis said simply, in every possible way. Jake was quiet for a long moment, trying to imagine explaining this conversation to Daniel, to Mrs. Patterson, to anyone in his normal life. This is completely crazy, he said finally. The best things in life usually are, Alexis replied. Jake, I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to think about it. Spend some time with me. Let me spend some time with Daniel. See if what I'm proposing could actually work for all of us. And if it doesn't work, then we end the marriage and remain friends. I'd still want to help with Daniel's education, but as a friend rather than a stepmother. Jake looked at her carefully. You'd really do that? Help with Daniel's schooling even if this marriage thing doesn't work out? Jake, that boy is your entire world. Anyone who becomes part of your life becomes part of his life by extension. Of course I'd help with his education. He deserves every opportunity to reach his potential. For the first time since she'd made her shocking proposal, Jake felt something other than disbelief. There was genuine caring in her voice when she talked about Daniel, and that mattered more to him than any amount of money. Let me ask you something. If I said yes to this insane proposal, what would happen to your company? Your board of directors, your business relationships? She smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. That's the beauty of it. Marriage to you would actually solve several problems for me professionally. The board has been pressuring me to settle down, to show more stability in my personal life. They think it would be good for the company's image if I weren't seen as a workaholic robot with no life outside the office. So I'd be a convenient PR move. You'd be the best thing that ever happened to me, Alexis said simply, in every possible way. Jake was quiet for a long moment, trying to imagine explaining this conversation to Daniel, to Mrs. Patterson, to anyone in his normal life. This is completely crazy, he said finally. The best things in life usually are, Alexis replied. Jake, I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you to think about it. Spend some time with me. Let me spend some time with Daniel. See if what we're proposing could actually work for all of us. And if it doesn't work, then we end the marriage and remain friends. I'd still want to help with Daniel's education, but as a friend rather than a stepmother. Jake looked at her carefully. You'd really do that? Help with Daniel's schooling even if this marriage thing doesn't work out? Jake, that boy is your entire world. Anyone who becomes part of your life becomes part of his life by extension. Of course, I'd help with his education. He deserves every opportunity to reach his potential. For the first time since she'd made her shocking proposal, Jake felt something other than disbelief. There was genuine caring in her voice when she talked about Daniel, and that mattered more to him than any amount of money.
By the time he pulled into the driveway of their small house, Jake had decided on a modified version of the truth. He'd tell Daniel about meeting Alexis, about her gratitude, and about her wanting to meet them both for dinner. He'd leave out the marriage proposal until he had a better sense of whether Alexis was serious or simply dealing with post-traumatic stress in an unusual way.
Daniel was waiting on the front porch with his homework spread across the wooden steps, taking advantage of the afternoon sunshine. He looked up as Jake approached, and his face immediately brightened with curiosity. "How did it go, Dad? Was she nice? Did she thank you? Was she really rich?" Jake sat down beside his son, moving a math worksheet to make room. "She was very nice, very grateful, and yes, she seems to be quite wealthy. Her name is Alexis Whitmore, and she runs a technology company." "I knew it," Daniel said with the satisfaction of being proven right. "What kind of technology company?" "Software development, business applications, that sort of thing." Jake paused, watching his son's face. "She wants to meet you, actually. She asked if we'd have dinner with her tomorrow night." Daniel's eyes widened. "Really? She wants to meet me? Why?" "Because I told her about you, about how smart you are, about the enrichment program." Jake chose his words carefully. "She's interested in helping kids get better educational opportunities." "Helping how?" "I'm not sure yet. We'll find out more tomorrow when we meet her." Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the careful consideration he brought to everything important. "Dad, are you nervous about seeing her again?" The question caught Jake off guard. "Why would you think I'm nervous?" "Because you're doing that thing with your hands where you rub them on your jeans when you're thinking about something big, and you have that look in your eyes like when you're trying to figure out if something is too good to be true." Jake looked down and realized he was indeed rubbing his palms against his denim, a nervous habit he'd apparently developed without noticing. His son's perceptiveness never failed to amaze him. "I guess I am a little nervous," Jake admitted. "She's very different from anyone I've ever met. Very smart, very successful. Sometimes when people have that much money, they live in a completely different world from us." "But she still wanted to thank you personally," Daniel pointed out. "That means she's probably a good person, right? Bad people don't usually go out of their way to say thank you." "You're probably right about that." "And Dad," Daniel said, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when he was about to say something he thought might be important. "Dad, maybe it's okay to let someone help us for once. I know you always say we have to solve our own problems, but maybe sometimes good people want to help other good people, and that's okay too." Jake stared at his son, wondering when Daniel had become so wise about adult relationships and the complicated dynamics of accepting help. "When did you get so smart about people?" "I pay attention," Daniel said with a small shrug. "And I read a lot of books about different kinds of families and how they work." That evening, while Daniel worked on a science project at the kitchen table, Jake found himself researching Alexis Whitmore online. What he discovered made his head spin all over again. Whitmore Technologies wasn't just successful, it was a massive corporation with offices on 3 continents. Alexis herself was featured on the covers of business magazines, listed among the most powerful women in tech, and worth an estimated $2.8 billion according to Forbes. There were photos of her at charity galas, industry conferences, and board meetings, always impeccably dressed and radiating the kind of confidence that came from being incredibly good at what you did. But there were also articles about her personal life, or rather, the notable absence of one. Business journals speculated about her workaholic tendencies, her lack of long-term relationships, and what one particularly unflattering piece called her robotic dedication to profit over people. Reading these articles, Jake began to understand what Alexis had been trying to tell him in the hospital. Here was a woman who had built an empire, but had apparently sacrificed everything personal in the process. The more he read, the more her marriage proposal began to make a strange kind of sense. The next day passed slowly. Jake spent the morning doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, fixing Mrs. Chen's fence, cleaning out the gutters for old Mr. Rodriguez, anything to keep his hands busy while his mind raced with questions about the evening ahead. Daniel came home from school practically vibrating with excitement about meeting Alexis. He'd changed clothes twice and spent 20 minutes trying to decide whether to bring one of his science books to show her. "What if she doesn't like me?" he asked as they drove toward the restaurant where they were supposed to meet her. "She's going to love you," Jake said with complete confidence. "You're impossible not to love." "But what if she thinks I'm too young to understand grown-up things? What if she talks down to me like some adults do?" "If she does that, then she's not the person I think she is, but I don't think you need to worry about that." They arrived at Millbrook Valley's only upscale restaurant, a converted Victorian house called the Garden Room that served what the locals considered fancy food. Jake had eaten there exactly twice in his life, both times for special occasions he couldn't really afford. Alexis was already seated at a corner table, and Jake's breath caught when he saw her. She was wearing a simple blue dress and minimal makeup, her hair loose around her shoulders, but she still managed to look elegant in a way that made everyone else in the restaurant seem underdressed by comparison. She stood up as they approached, and Jake noticed she was moving carefully, obviously still sore from her injuries. But her smile was warm and genuine as she looked at Daniel. "You must be Daniel," she said, extending her hand for a formal handshake. "I'm Alexis. Your father has told me so many wonderful things about you." Daniel shook her hand solemnly, and Jake could see him taking her measure with the careful assessment he brought to all new adults in his life. "Thank you for wanting to meet me," Daniel said politely. "Dad said you run a technology company." "I do," Alexis said, as they all sat down. "Do you know much about technology?" "Some," Daniel said, warming up slightly. "I'm really interested in how software can solve real-world problems. Like, there are these apps that help people with disabilities communicate better, and programs that can predict natural disasters to help people evacuate safely." Alexis's eyebrows rose in obvious surprise. "That's exactly the kind of thinking that drives the best innovations in our industry. Where did you learn about those applications?" "The library has computers, and I read a lot online when I finish my regular homework early." "What else interests you besides technology?" For the next hour, Jake watched in fascination as Alexis and Daniel fell into an easy conversation about everything from marine biology to renewable energy to space exploration. Alexis didn't talk down to Daniel or dismiss his ideas. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions and shared her own knowledge in a way that clearly delighted his son. "You know," Alexis said as they finished their main course, "my company has an internship program for high school students who are interested in technology careers. It's usually for kids who are 15 or 16, but I think we could make an exception for someone with your level of curiosity and intelligence." Daniel's face lit up. "Really? That would be amazing!" "Of course, you need to keep your grades up and continue developing your knowledge base, but I think you have real potential in this field." Jake felt a warmth spreading through his chest as he watched the interaction between Alexis and his son. Whatever her motivations, whatever complicated proposal she'd made in the hospital, it was clear that her interest in Daniel was genuine. "Alexis," Daniel said suddenly, his voice taking on that careful tone again, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you going to marry my dad?" Jake nearly choked on his water. He'd been so focused on watching them get to know each other that he'd forgotten how direct his son could be when something was important to him. Alexis looked surprised but not flustered. "What makes you ask that?" "Because Dad has been acting weird since he met you. Not bad weird, but like he's thinking about something big and scary and maybe wonderful all at the same time. And because you keep looking at him like you're trying to figure out if he's as good as you think he is." Jake stared at his son in amazement. When had Daniel become so perceptive about adult emotions? "Daniel," Jake started to say, but Alexis held up a gentle hand. "It's okay," she said, then looked directly at Daniel. "Yes, I did ask your father to marry me. I know that probably sounds crazy since we just met, but sometimes adults make decisions that seem unusual but make sense for good reasons." "What kind of good reasons?" Daniel asked, And Jake could hear the genuine curiosity in his voice rather than judgment. "Well," Alexis said carefully, "your father is an extraordinary man. He saved my life, but more than that, he's the kind of person who puts the people he loves ahead of everything else. I think he could teach me a lot about what's really important in life." "And what would you teach him?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Jake found himself genuinely curious about her answer. "I'd teach him that he doesn't have to carry every burden alone, that accepting help isn't weakness, and that the people who care about you want to share both the good times and the difficult ones." Daniel nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "And you'd help with my school stuff, the enrichment program and college eventually?" "I'd help with whatever you needed to reach your potential. But Daniel, I want you to understand something important. Even if your father and I decided not to get married, I'd still want to help with your education. You're a remarkable young man, and you deserve every opportunity to succeed." "So you'd be like a family friend either way?" "Either way," Alexis confirmed. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing this information. Finally, he looked at his father. "Dad, I think you should say yes." "Daniel," Jake began. "No, listen," Daniel said, with the same matter-of-fact tone he'd used when offering to give up the enrichment program. "Alexis is smart and nice, and she cares about both of us. You're lonely, even though you try to hide it, and she's lonely too, even though she's successful. Maybe you could help each other not be lonely anymore." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. His 10-year-old son had just summed up the entire situation with more clarity than Jake had managed in 2 days of thinking about it. "Besides," Daniel added with a small grin, "if you marry her, I get to have a mom again, and a really cool mom who runs a technology company."
Alexis's eyes filled with tears, and Jake realized that Daniel had just given her something she'd probably never expected to have. Unconditional acceptance from a child who saw her not as a business mogul or a source of financial stability, but simply as someone who could be part of their family. "Daniel," Alexis said softly, "would you really want me to be your stepmother?" "If you promise to love Dad and not try to change who we are, then yes," Daniel said seriously, "but I have one condition." "What's that?" "You have to learn how to make pancakes. Dad tries, but they always come out kinda weird." Alexis laughed through her tears. "I think that's a condition I can live with." As they drove home that night, Daniel chattered excitedly about Alexis, about the internship program, about the possibility of having a stepmother who understood science and technology. But Jake found himself thinking about something else entirely. The moment when Alexis had promised to help with Daniel's education, regardless of what happened between them. That promise, more than anything else, convinced him that her proposal might not be as crazy as it sounded, because anyone who would make that kind of commitment to a child they'd just met was someone worth taking a chance on. The question was whether Jake was brave enough to say yes to the most unlikely proposal in the history of marriage. 3 days after the dinner at the garden room, Jake was beginning to believe that maybe fairy tales could happen in real life. Alexis had been discharged from the hospital and was staying at the Millbrook Valley Inn, the town's modest but comfortable bed and breakfast. She'd spent each day getting to know their small community, walking the downtown area, chatting with shop owners, and even helping Daniel with his science project in the evenings. Jake was loading lumber into his truck for a small repair job when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something about it seemed official. "Jake Martinez?" "Yes, this is Jake." "Mr. Martinez, this is Patricia Wong from the Millbrook Valley Planning Commission. I'm calling to inform you about some upcoming changes that may affect your property on Maple Street." Jake's stomach immediately tightened. Calls from government offices were never good news in his experience. "What kind of changes?"
We've had several inquiries recently about zoning modifications in your neighborhood. There's been significant interest from developers in acquiring properties for a large-scale residential and commercial project. What kind of project? A luxury residential community with integrated shopping and recreational facilities. The preliminary proposals show acquisition of approximately 200 properties in the Maple Street area, including yours. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Acquisition? You mean they want to buy our houses? Eventually, yes. The development company has been working with the Planning Commission for the past 6 months to get the necessary approvals for rezoning. They're calling it Millbrook Heights, a premium lifestyle community for affluent relocants from Portland and Seattle. Who's the development company? Jake asked, though something cold in his stomach already suspected he knew. Whitmore Development Group. They're a subsidiary of Whitmore Technologies, very well-funded, very professional operation. They've assured us that all property acquisitions will be handled fairly and that displaced residents will receive generous compensation packages. The phone felt heavy in Jake's hand. Whitmore Technologies? Yes, do you know them? The CEO, Alexis Whitmore, has been personally involved in the planning process. Very impressive woman, very committed to creating something special for Millbrook Valley. Jake ended the call without saying goodbye, his mind reeling with the implications of what he'd just learned. Alexis's company wasn't just interested in his community, they were actively working to destroy it. And she'd known this the entire time she'd been playing house with him and Daniel. For the past 3 days, he'd been falling for a woman who was simultaneously planning to tear down his house and displace his neighbors. The marriage proposal, the interest in Daniel, the promises about education and opportunities, all of it had been an elaborate performance designed to manipulate him into accepting the inevitable destruction of his life. Jake pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for several minutes trying to calm down enough to think clearly. Daniel would be home from school soon, and Jake needed to figure out how to handle this situation without destroying his son's newfound hope and excitement. His phone buzzed with a text from Alexis. Finished my meetings for the day, would love to take you and Daniel to dinner again tonight. I have some exciting news to share about the internship program. Exciting news. Jake stared at the message, feeling a mixture of rage and betrayal that made his hands shake. She had exciting news while his entire world was being systematically dismantled by her company. He texted back, "We need to talk. Now. Meet me at the park on Elm Street in 20 minutes. Come alone." The response came immediately. "Is everything okay? You sound upset." "Just be there." Jake arrived at the small neighborhood park first and chose a bench that faced away from the playground equipment. He didn't want any children around for this conversation. When Alexis arrived 15 minutes later, she was walking quickly and looked genuinely concerned. "Jake, what's wrong? You sounded angry in your text." "Tell me about Whitmore Development Group," Jake said without preamble. The color drained from Alexis's face, and Jake saw the exact moment when she realized her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. "Jake, I can explain."
Explain what? Explain how you've been lying to me and Daniel for 3 days while your company plans to tear down our house? Explain how you made me believe you cared about us while you were secretly working to destroy our community?
"It's not like that," Alexis said, sitting down on the bench beside him.
The development project was already in motion long before I met you. I didn't even know the specific location details. Stop lying to me." Jake's voice was louder than he'd intended, and a woman walking her dog across the park looked over with concern. He forced himself to speak more quietly. "I just got off the phone with the Planning Commission. Your company has been working on this project for 6 months. You've been personally involved in the planning process." Alexis closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Yes, Whitmore Development is a subsidiary of my company. Yes, I approved the initial feasibility study for the Millbrook Heights project. But Jake, I swear to you, I didn't make the connection between the development site and your specific neighborhood until yesterday. Yesterday? And you didn't think that was important enough to mention? I was trying to figure out how to tell you without destroying what we've been building together. What we've been building? Jake stood up and began pacing in front of the bench. We haven't been building anything, Alexis. You've been running some kind of con game, and I've been the mark. That's not true, and you know it. Alexis's voice was quiet, but firm. My feelings for you and Daniel are real. The marriage proposal was real. Everything I've told you about wanting to change my life is real. How convenient that your life change involves acquiring my property for a fraction of its value and displacing my entire neighborhood. The compensation packages are extremely generous. I don't want your compensation. Jake exploded. I want my home, my community, my life that I've spent 10 years building for my son. I want the neighborhood where Daniel has friends, where people know his name, where he feels safe and loved. Alexis stood up and tried to approach him, but Jake backed away. Jake, please listen to me. I can stop the project. I can redirect the development to a different location. Can you? Or will your board of directors override you? Will your shareholders demand maximum profit regardless of the human cost? I'm the majority shareholder. The final decision is mine. And what happens when I don't marry you? What happens when you realize that the small-town fantasy you've been playing isn't sustainable? Do you go back to your old life and suddenly remember that the Millbrook Heights project is too profitable to cancel? Alexis looked stricken. I would never do that. You already did it. Jake's voice was raw with betrayal. You spent 3 days in my house, playing with my son, making him believe he was going to have a mother who cared about him, all while your company was planning to destroy his home. Daniel will have a better home, a bigger house, better schools, more opportunities. Daniel will have a house that's not his home in a place where he doesn't belong. Jake interrupted. Do you know what he told me last night? He said he was excited because he thought you understood what our life was really like. He thought you cared about our community, our neighbors, the place where we've built our family. Tears were running down Alexis's face now. I do care. I care more than I've ever cared about anything in my life. No, you don't. You care about the idea of us. You care about how you make you feel, but you don't care enough to actually put our needs ahead of your business interests. That's not fair, Jake. You're not even giving me a chance to explain what? Explain what? That you conveniently forgot to mention that your company was planning to demolish my house? That you somehow overlooked the fact that your development project would destroy the community you've been pretending to care about? I was trying to find a way to fix it before I told you. Fix it? This isn't something you fix, Alexis. This is something you don't do in the first place if you actually care about people. Jake sat back down on the bench, suddenly feeling exhausted. Do you know what the worst part is? I was actually starting to believe you. I was starting to think that maybe Daniel and I could have something good in our lives for once. You can still have something good, Alexis said desperately. This doesn't have to change anything between us. It changes everything. Jake looked at her directly. Because now I know who you really are. You're not the woman who wanted to learn about family and love and what really matters in life. You're the CEO who saw an opportunity to acquire some property and decided to make the process more pleasant by manipulating the current owner. That's not true, isn't it? You said yourself that marriage to me would solve problems for you professionally, a stable personal life, good PR, a way to make your board happy. Add in the fact that I'd be less likely to fight the development if I was personally invested in your success, and this whole thing starts to look like a very sophisticated business strategy. Alexis was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Even if it started that way, which it didn't, it's not that way now. I love you, Jake. I love Daniel. I want to be part of your family.
You want to be part of the family you're destroying? Jake shook his head. That's not love, Alexis. That's guilt. What do you want me to do? How can I prove to you that this is real? Jake stood up again. Cancel the project. publicly announce that Whitmore Technologies is withdrawing from all development plans in Millbrook Valley. Do it tomorrow, before anyone else finds out about our relationship." "Jake, I can't make that kind of decision overnight. There are contracts, investors, employees whose jobs depend on this project." "There it is," Jake said sadly. "When it comes down to choosing between your business interests and our relationship, business wins. Just like it always has. Just like it always will." "That's not what I'm saying." "It's exactly what you're saying. You're explaining to me why you can't put Daniel and me ahead of your profit margins. You're making the same calculation you've always made. What's best for Whitmore Technologies?" Jake started walking toward his truck. "Tell Daniel I had to work late tonight. Tell him whatever you want about why we won't be seeing each other anymore. But don't tell him the truth about the development project. He doesn't need to know that the woman he thought might become his mother is the same person who's planning to tear down his home." "Jake, please, don't do this. Don't walk away from us." Jake turned back one last time. "You walked away from us the moment you decided not to tell me the truth. Everything else is just details." As he drove home, Jake felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over him like a heavy coat. For 3 days, he'd allowed himself to hope for something better, something extraordinary. Daniel had been so excited about having Alexis in their lives, so hopeful about the future. Now Jake had to figure out how to tell his son that their fairy tale was over before it had really begun. And somehow that felt like the cruelest part of all. Not just that his own heart was broken, but that he'd have to break Daniel's heart too. Jake spent the drive home practicing different versions of the conversation he was about to have with Daniel. How do you tell a 10-year-old that the woman he'd started calling almost mom had been lying to them? How do you explain that business and betrayal could be wrapped up in the same package, delivered with a smile and promises of a better future? By the time he pulled into the driveway, Jake had settled on the simplest version of the truth. Alexis had to go back to her regular life. Their worlds were too different, and sometimes adults make decisions that disappoint everyone involved. Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table when Jake walked in, surrounded by science textbooks and notebook paper, working on what appeared to be a complex diagram of solar panel efficiency. He looked up with the bright smile that had become his default expression over the past few days. "Dad, perfect timing! I'm working on a proposal for the school science fair, and I wanted to run it by Alexis tonight. Do you think she'd understand the technical aspects of photovoltaic energy conversion?" The enthusiasm in his son's voice hit Jake like a physical blow. Daniel had been transformed over the past 3 days, energized by the prospect of having someone in his life who understood his intellectual curiosity and could help him explore it. "Daniel, we need to talk about Alexis." Something in Jake's tone must have warned Daniel that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. His smile faded and he carefully set down his pencil. "She's leaving, isn't she?" The question was so direct, so matter-of-fact, that Jake wondered if his son had been expecting this moment all along. "Yes, she's leaving. Her work requires her to be in other places, and our lives are just too different." Daniel nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense to him. "Did you have a fight?" "We had a disagreement about some important things." "About money? About the fact that she's rich and we're not?" Jake sat down across from his son, studying the careful neutrality on his face. "Something like that." "I figured. It seemed too good to be true, you know? Someone like her wanting to be part of a family like ours." The resignation in his son's voice broke Jake's heart all over again. At 10 years old, Daniel was already learning to expect disappointment, to protect himself from hope that seemed too big for their circumstances. "Daniel, listen to me carefully. What happened between Alexis and me has nothing to do with your worth or our family's value. You are an extraordinary kid,
and any woman would be lucky to be your stepmother. This situation is about adult complications that have nothing to do with you." "I know," Daniel said, but there was something hollow in his voice that suggested he didn't entirely believe it. "Did she at least say goodbye? Or thank you for letting me meet her?" Jake felt another stab of anger toward Alexis. Even in her deception, she'd managed to make Daniel care about her approval, her presence in their lives. Now his son was worried about basic courtesy from someone who had been systematically lying to them. "She told me to tell you that meeting you was one of the best parts of her visit to Millbrook Valley. She thinks you're going to do incredible things with your life." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Jake was becoming uncomfortably aware of how easy it was to shade the truth when you wanted to protect someone from pain. "Will I ever see her again?"
The question hung in the air between them. Jake wanted to say no, to close this chapter cleanly and help Daniel move on. But something about the hope barely contained in his son's voice made him hesitate. "I don't know, buddy. Her life is very complicated, and she travels a lot for work." Daniel nodded and went back to his science fair project, but Jake could see the change in his posture, the way his shoulders had drooped slightly, the way his enthusiasm for the solar panel diagram had evaporated. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Jake sat on his front porch and tried to process the events of the past week. 7 days ago, his biggest problem had been finding $1,200 for Daniel's enrichment program. Now he was dealing with the aftermath of a relationship that had never really existed, a marriage proposal that had been based on lies, and the impending destruction of his neighborhood. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Alexis. Jake, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know that I've spent the last 6 hours in emergency board meetings. I'm fighting to cancel the Millbrook Heights project. It's more complicated than I expected, but I'm not giving up." Jake stared at the message for several minutes before typing back, "Don't do me any favors." Her response came immediately. "This isn't a favor. This is me trying to do the right thing." The right thing would have been not planning to destroy my community in the first place. "You're right, but I can't change what I did before I met you. I can only try to fix it now." Jake turned off his phone without responding. He didn't want to hear about Alexis's attempts to fix the situation. He didn't want to care about her board meetings or her complicated business obligations. Most of all, he didn't want to feel the tiny flicker of hope that her words had sparked in his chest. The next morning brought a series of phone calls that confirmed Jake's worst fears about the development project. Mrs. Chen called to say she'd received a letter from Whitmore Development expressing interest in purchasing her property. Mr. Rodriguez had gotten a similar letter, as had most of their neighbors on Maple Street. "They're offering good money," Mrs. Chen said when she stopped by with coffee and worried questions. "More than I ever expected to see for this old house. But Jake, where am I supposed to go? I've lived here for 30 years. My garden, my neighbors, my whole life is in this place." Jake didn't have any answers for her. He spent the morning fielding similar calls from other neighbors, all of them confused and concerned about the sudden interest in their properties. Word was spreading quickly through their small community, and the mood was shifting from curiosity to anxiety. By noon, Jake's phone was ringing constantly. He finally turned it off and drove to the lake where he'd first encountered Alexis's crashed car. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was returning to the place where this whole nightmare had started, looking for the same peace and clarity he'd been seeking a week ago. The accident site had been cleaned up, the damaged tree trimmed back, the broken glass and metal debris removed. If Jake hadn't known what had happened there, he might have walked past without noticing anything unusual. He sat on a fallen log near the spot where he'd performed CPR on Alexis and tried to make sense of his feelings. The betrayal was real and deep, but underneath it was something more complicated. Despite everything, he missed her. He missed the conversations, the way she'd looked at Daniel, the sense of possibility that had surrounded their brief time together.
Jake's reflection was interrupted by the sound of a car approaching on the lakeside road. A sleek black sedan pulled up near the accident site, and Alexis got out. She was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, but she looked exhausted and older than she had just 2 days earlier. "I thought I might find you here," she said, walking toward him. "I don't want to talk to you, Alexis." "I know, but I need to tell you what happened in the board meeting last night." Jake stood up, preparing to leave. "I don't care about your board meeting." "I resigned." The words stopped Jake mid-step. He turned to look at her, trying to read her expression. "What?" "I resigned as CEO of Whitmore Technologies, effective immediately." Alexis's voice was steady, but Jake could see the emotional toll the decision had taken on her. "I also liquidated my personal investment portfolio and bought out the development contracts for the Millbrook Heights project." Jake stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means the development is canceled. Your neighborhood is safe. Your house, Mrs. Chen's garden, Mr. Rodriguez's workshop, all of it stays exactly as it is." "Why?" "Because you were right. Because when it came down to choosing between my business interests and doing the right thing, I chose wrong. Because I realized that everything I've built over the past 10 years means nothing if I can't look at myself in the mirror." Jake felt the world shifting around him again, but this time in a direction he hadn't expected. "You gave up your company?" "I gave up a job that was slowly killing my soul. I kept enough money to live comfortably, but I walked away from the rest of it." Alexis sat down on the log where Jake had been sitting. "I also called Daniel's school and arranged to fund his enrichment program through college, regardless of what happens between us."
"Alexis, I'm not telling you this to manipulate you into forgiving me," she said quickly. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know that I chose to put you and Daniel ahead of everything else, even if it's too late to matter." Jake sat down beside her, maintaining careful distance, but needing to process what she just told him. "What are you going to do now?" "I don't know. For the first time in my adult life, I have no plan, no strategy, no 5-year projections." Alexis managed a small smile. "It's terrifying and liberating at the same time." They sat in silence for several minutes, both looking out at the lake where Jake had been walking when everything started. "I'm sorry," Alexis said finally. "I'm sorry I lied to you. Sorry I hurt Daniel. Sorry I made you doubt whether my feelings were real. But Jake, I need you to know that everything I told you about loving you and wanting to be part of your family, that was the most honest thing I've ever said in my life." Jake closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had happened between them. The betrayal was real, but so was the sacrifice she'd just made. The question was whether trust, once broken, could ever be rebuilt. "What do you want from me, Alexis?" "Nothing," she said simply. "I just wanted you to know that sometimes people can choose to change, even when it costs them everything they thought they wanted." As Jake drove home that afternoon, his mind was spinning with questions he couldn't answer. Alexis had given up her company, canceled the development project, and funded Daniel's education with no expectation of anything in return. It was either the most elaborate manipulation he'd ever encountered or genuine proof that people could choose love over self-interest. The question was whether Jake was brave enough to find out which one it was. The news of Alexis Whitmore's resignation from her own company hit the business world like a seismic shock. By the next morning, Jake's phone was buzzing with calls from reporters who had somehow tracked down the connection to the story. The Portland Business Journal wanted a statement. Seattle tech blogs were speculating about the mysterious personal reasons cited in Whitmore Technologies' press release. Financial news outlets were calling it either the most selfless act in corporate history or evidence of a complete mental breakdown. He ignored them all and drove Daniel to school as usual. But he could feel the weight of unwanted attention settling over their quiet life like fog rolling in from the coast. "Dad," Daniel said as they pulled up to the school drop-off area, "some kids are saying they saw news trucks downtown this morning. Is that about Alexis?" He had been dreading this conversation. Yes, it's about her. Good news or bad news? Complicated news, Jake said, which had become his standard response to most questions about Alexis Whitmore. Daniel unbuckled his seatbelt but didn't immediately get out of the truck. "Dad, can I ask you something without you getting upset?" "You can ask me anything, buddy." "Do you still love her?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He had been so focused on his anger and sense of betrayal that he hadn't allowed himself to examine the deeper emotions underneath. "Why do you ask?" "Because you've been sad in a different way since she left. Not just disappointed sad, but like someone you really cared about went away." Daniel's 10-year-old wisdom was sometimes almost too much to bear. It's complicated when someone you care about hurts you, even if they didn't mean to. But if they try really hard to fix what they broke, doesn't that mean something? "Yes, it means something," Jake said quietly. "That means something. I hope you figure it out, Dad. I think she really does love us, even if she made mistakes." After dropping Daniel at school, Jake drove to Morrison Construction to see if Bill had any work available. He needed something physical to do with his hands, something concrete and fixable to distract himself from the emotional chaos of the past few days. "Jake," Bill Morrison called out as soon as he saw him. "Good timing. I just got a call about a big residential project that needs immediate attention. Custom renovation work, very particular client, paying premium rates for quality craftsmanship." "Sounds good," Jake said, grateful for the distraction. "What's the address?" Bill handed him a work order. "It's the old Henderson place on Elm Street. Been empty for about 2 years, but someone just bought it and wants a complete overhaul. Kitchen, bathrooms, flooring, electrical updates, the works." Jake looked at the address and felt his stomach drop. The Henderson place was 3 blocks from his house, a beautiful Victorian-era home that had been on the market forever because it needed extensive renovations that most buyers couldn't afford. Who's the new owner? Some investment company from Portland. They want the work done fast and they're willing to pay for it. The project manager specifically requested you actually, said they'd heard good things about your craftsmanship. Jake drove to the Henderson house with a growing sense of unease. The property had been neglected for years, but someone had clearly started basic cleanup work. The overgrown yard had been cleared, the broken front steps had been temporarily repaired, and there were signs of recent electrical work.
A familiar black sedan was parked in the driveway. Jake sat in his truck for a full minute, debating whether to drive away or go knock on the door. The decision was made for him when Alexis emerged from the house, wearing work clothes and carrying what appeared to be paint samples. She saw his truck and walked over, moving carefully on the uneven driveway. The expensive business attire was gone, replaced by jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that looked like it had actually been used for manual labor. "Before you get angry," she said as Jake rolled down his window, "I didn't know Bill was going to call you. I asked him to recommend the best contractor in town for renovation work. He said your name without me mentioning any connection." "You bought the Henderson place?" "I made an offer yesterday. It was accepted this morning." Alexis gestured toward the house. "I figured if I'm going to stay in Millbrook Valley, I should probably have somewhere to live that's not a bed and breakfast." "You're staying?" "I don't have anywhere else to go," she said with a self-deprecating smile. "Turns out, when you resign from your own company in a blaze of moral clarity, other companies are reluctant to hire you. Something about being unpredictable and potentially unstable." Jake got out of his truck and looked at the house properly. It was a beautiful structure underneath the neglect, solid bones, good proportions, the kind of craftsmanship that didn't exist in modern construction. Why this house? Why this neighborhood? Because it's 3 blocks from you and Daniel. Close enough that I can be part of your lives if you let me. Far enough away that I'm not imposing if you won't. Alexis, I know you don't trust me. I know I have to earn that back, if it's even possible. But Jake, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to live in this town, fix up this house,
and prove to you every single day that what I feel for you and Daniel is real." Jake walked around the exterior of the house, noting the work that would need to be done: new roof, foundation repairs, complete electrical and plumbing updates. It was easily a 6-month project, maybe longer if it was done right. "This is going to cost a fortune to renovate properly. I have enough money for the renovation and to live comfortably for the rest of my life. What I don't have is a family, or a community, or a reason to get up in the morning that has nothing to do with profit margins." "So you're going to buy your way into our community?" "I'm going to earn my way into your community, starting with hiring local contractors, buying materials from local suppliers, and proving that I'm committed to being here for the long term." Jake studied her face, trying to read her motivations. "What if this doesn't work? What if Daniel and I can't get past what happened? Then I'll still have a beautiful house in a town where I know at least 2 people who helped me remember what it means to be human. That's more than I had a week ago." They were interrupted by the arrival of a delivery truck carrying what appeared to be a massive amount of building supplies. Jake recognized the logo, Henderson Lumber, the local supply company. "You've already started ordering materials?" "I figured if you decided to take the job, we should be ready to start immediately. And if you don't take the job, Bill said he could recommend other contractors who could use the work." The delivery driver approached them with a clipboard. "Delivery for the Henderson renovation project. Where do you want these?" Jake found himself automatically directing the delivery, telling the driver where to stack the lumber and position the pallets of materials. It was instinctive. He had been managing construction deliveries for years. "So," Alexis said, as they watched the truck unload, "will you take the job?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering all the implications. Working on Alexis's house would mean seeing her regularly for months. It would mean accepting money from her, even if it was legitimate payment for legitimate work. It would mean taking the risk that his feelings for her might resurface, or that Daniel might get attached to her again only to be disappointed. But it would also mean steady work at premium wages. It would mean being able to provide for Daniel without constantly worrying about money. And maybe, just maybe, it would mean getting to know the real Alexis Whitmore. Not the CEO who made calculated business decisions, but the woman who had given up everything to do the right thing. "I'll take the job," Jake said finally. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "This is a business relationship. Contractor and client. I don't want any special treatment, any personal favors, or any attempts to use the work as an excuse to spend time with Daniel and me." "Agreed." "I want everything documented. Contracts, timelines, payment schedules. If this is going to be a business relationship, it's going to be completely professional." "Of course. And if you change your mind about staying in Millbrook Valley, if you decide this small-town life isn't for you, I want 30 days' notice so I can finish the job properly." Alexis met his eyes directly. "Jake, I'm not changing my mind. This is where I want to be." "We'll see," Jake said. "People say a lot of things when they're caught up in the emotion of a big life change. Living with the consequences day after day is different."
"Then I guess I'll have to prove it to you day after day." Jake drove home that afternoon. He found himself thinking about second chances and the difference between saying you want to change and actually doing the work required to change. Alexis had made dramatic gestures, resigning from her company, canceling the development project, buying a house in their small town. But gestures were easy compared to the daily reality of building a different kind of life. The real test would be whether she could sustain this choice when the novelty wore off, when the isolation of small-town life set in, when she realized that being a regular person was harder than being a powerful CEO. Jake was willing to give her the chance to prove herself, but he wasn't going to make it easy. If Alexis Whitmore wanted to be part of their community, she was going to have to earn it the same way everyone else did, through time, consistency, and genuine care for the people around her.
The question was whether the woman who had spent 10 years building a corporate empire had the patience and humility required to build something more valuable but far less flashy, a real life in a real place with real people who mattered. Jake supposed they were all about to find out. 6 months later, Jake stood in the renovated kitchen of the Henderson house, running his hand along the smooth granite countertops and admiring the way the morning light streamed through the restored Victorian windows. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a neglected, deteriorating structure was now a warm, inviting home that managed to honor its historic character while embracing modern functionality. More remarkable than the house's transformation, however, was the transformation of its owner. Alexis emerged from the basement, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, wearing jeans that were genuinely dirty from actual work rather than carefully distressed by a designer. She was carrying a wrench and had a smudge of grease on her cheek from helping Jake install the new water heater. "The pressure's perfect now," she said, wiping her hands on a work towel. "I think we finally got all the air bubbles out of the lines." Jake nodded, though he was more interested in observing the woman in front of him than discussing plumbing. The polished corporate executive who had made that shocking marriage proposal in a hospital bed 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely comfortable in work boots and tool belts. The final inspection is scheduled for next Friday. After that, the renovation will be officially complete. There was a moment of awkward silence as they both realized what that meant. For 6 months, they'd had the excuse of contractor and client to spend time together, to rebuild trust through shared work and common goals. Once the house was finished, that excuse would disappear. "Jake," Alexis said carefully, "I know our business relationship is ending, but I hope that doesn't mean you and Daniel would disappear from my life entirely." Over the past 6 months, Jake had watched Alexis integrate herself into the Millbrook Valley community with patience and genuine effort. She'd volunteered at the library's computer literacy program, teaching seniors how to use email and browse the internet. She'd joined the PTA at Daniel's school and had somehow managed to revolutionize their fundraising efforts without making anyone feel stupid or inadequate. She'd become a regular at Morrison Construction's monthly safety meetings, learning about building codes and construction practices with the same intensity she'd once brought to quarterly earnings reports. Most importantly, she'd been consistently present in Daniel's life without overstepping boundaries or trying to replace anyone. She helped with homework when asked, attended school events when invited, and had somehow become the person Daniel turned to when he needed advice about science projects or wanted to discuss ideas that were too complex for most adults to follow. "Daniel would never forgive me if I cut you out of our lives now," Jake said. "You've become too important to him." "What about you?" Alexis asked quietly. "Have I become important to you?" It was the question Jake had been avoiding for months. Despite his professional boundaries, despite his determination to keep their relationship strictly business, he'd found himself falling for Alexis all over again. Not the dramatic, overwhelming attraction he'd felt during their first meeting, but something deeper and more sustainable. Respect for the woman she'd chosen to become, admiration for the work she'd put into changing her life, and love for the way she'd embraced his son and his community. "Yes," he said simply. "You've become very important to both of us." Alexis smiled, but there was still uncertainty in her eyes. "Important enough that you might consider giving me another chance? Not as a business arrangement this time, but as two people who care about each other and want to build something together?" Before Jake could answer, the front door burst open and Daniel's voice echoed through the house. "Dad! Alexis! You have to see this!" Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a thick envelope, his face glowing with excitement. "It's from the state science fair. I made it to the final round." Alexis let out a delighted laugh and swept Daniel into a congratulatory hug. "That's incredible! I knew your renewable energy project was brilliant." "I couldn't have done it without your help with the technical aspects," Daniel said, then turned to his father. "Dad, this means I get to present at the state capitol next month, and if I place in the top 3, I get a scholarship to the summer science program at Oregon State University."
Jake felt a familiar swell of pride watching his son's excitement.
Daniel had blossomed over the past 6 months, encouraged by Alexis's technical knowledge and genuine interest in his ideas. The enrichment program that had once seemed financially impossible was now a reality. But more than that, Daniel had gained confidence in his abilities and his potential. "We should celebrate," Alexis said. "Dinner at the garden room?" "Actually," Daniel said, exchanging a look with his father that suggested they'd discussed this before, "I was thinking we should cook dinner here, in the new kitchen, as a family." The word hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning and possibility. "As a family?" Alexis repeated softly. "Well," Daniel said with the matter-of-fact tone that made him sound much older than 12, "you've been part of our family for months now. You come to my school events, you help with my homework, you worry about Dad when he's working late. The only thing missing is the official part." Jake looked at his son, then at Alexis, then back at Daniel. "What official part?" "The part where you ask her to marry you properly this time, instead of her asking you when she was confused from hitting her head." Alexis burst out laughing. "Is that what you think happened? That I only proposed because I had a concussion?" "Didn't you?" asked Daniel. "No," Alexis said, looking directly at Jake. "I proposed because I recognized something real and important when I saw it. The concussion had nothing to do with it." Jake felt something shift inside him, a final wall crumbling that he hadn't even realized he'd been maintaining. For 6 months, he'd been waiting for Alexis to prove that her transformation was genuine, that her commitment to our community and our family was real. But the proof wasn't in any single gesture or decision, it was in the accumulation of daily choices, small kindnesses, and consistent presence. "Daniel," Jake said without taking his eyes off Alexis, "would you go check if I left my toolbox in the basement?" "Dad, your toolbox is right there on the counter." "Then go check if I left anything else in the basement." Daniel grinned and disappeared through the basement door, clearly understanding that this was a conversation the adults needed to have alone. Jake moved closer to Alexis, close enough to see the hope and nervousness in her green eyes. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right? Being married to a contractor from a small town, dealing with my ex-wife's drama, helping raise a kid who's smarter than both of us combined. I gave up a multi-billion-dollar company to be here. I think I can handle whatever challenges come with being part of your family." "Our family," Jake corrected. "Our family," Alexis agreed. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box that he'd been carrying for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment. "I don't have a fancy speech prepared, and I can't offer you the kind of lifestyle you're used to. Jake Martinez, if you're about to apologize for not being wealthy enough for me, I'm going to hit you with that wrench." Jake laughed and dropped to one knee in the middle of the kitchen they'd renovated together, surrounded by the tools and materials that had become symbols of their rebuilt relationship. "Alexis Whitmore, will you marry me? Not because it makes business sense, not because it solves problems for either of us, but because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life building something beautiful with you." "Yes," Alexis said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, a simple band with a single diamond, nothing like the elaborate jewelry she'd once worn, but perfect for the life they were choosing together. Daniel's voice drifted up from the basement. "Can I come up now because I heard Alexis crying and I want to make sure those are happy tears?" "They're happy tears," Alexis called back, laughing through her emotion. Daniel bounded up the stairs and immediately noticed the ring on Alexis's finger. "Finally, I was starting to think you two were never going to figure it out." 6 months later, Jake stood at the altar of Millbrook Valley Small Community Church, watching Alexis walk down the aisle in a simple white dress, her face radiant with joy. Daniel stood beside him as best man, having insisted that his role in bringing them together earned him the honor despite his age. The ceremony was small and intimate. just close friends, neighbors, and the community that had embraced Alexis as one of their own. Mrs. Chen had brought flowers from her garden. Mr. Rodriguez had helped set up chairs. The entire town had contributed to a celebration that felt more like a family reunion than a formal wedding. As they exchanged vows they'd written themselves, Jake marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. A car accident that could have been tragedy had instead become the beginning of transformation for both of them. Alexis had learned to value relationships over profit margins, while Jake had learned to accept help and embrace the possibility of happiness. "I promise," Alexis said, holding his hands and looking directly into his eyes, "to choose love over business, family over profit, and our life together over everything else that might try to pull us apart."
"I promise," Jake replied, "to trust in the possibility of good things happening to good people, to believe that we deserve the happiness we've found together, and to never again assume that different worlds can't become one world." When they kissed, Daniel cheered louder than anyone else in the church. Later, at the reception in the community center, Jake watched his new wife dancing with Daniel to a song about family and belonging. Alexis had learned to find joy in simple moments: a successful science fair project, a perfectly renovated bathroom, a 10-year-old's unbridled enthusiasm for life. She'd also learned something that all her business success had never taught her: that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought, acquired, or strategically planned. They had to be built day by day through choices, sacrifices, and the willingness to believe that love was worth more than any amount of money. As Jake joined his wife and son on the dance floor, surrounded by the community that had become their extended family, he realized that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the simple decision to save a stranger's life. Everything else, the proposals, the transformations, the new beginnings, was just the beautiful consequence of choosing to care about another human being more than you cared about yourself. And in the end, that was the only business plan that really mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.